So for anybody listening, if you're asking, what's the best way to get creatine into our muscle faster? I say exercise. Don't worry about carbohydrates and protein and all that other stuff. I think creatine or exercise has been one of the best things to stimulate it. So exercise is foundational, and then creatine can hopefully give a small greater effect.
And would that be through natural production, or are you talking about oral supplementation and diet?
It's through a combination of diet, supplementation, and natural production. But in those studies, it was in the presence of a supplementation. So 5 gram dose of creatine is found in probably about 1 kilogram of a steak or seafood. So the cost of groceries, ethical treatment of animals, whatever your preference, it may be something to consider from a supplementation perspective. But those studies all based it on the powder, the boring white powder of creatine. Yeah.
Thank you to Apollo Neuro for sponsoring this episode of the show. The Apollo is my favorite wearable. It helps me manage my body. It helps me sleep better, remain focused, be more present. The Apollo was developed by neuroscientists and physicians. It delivers a silent, soothing, yes, I say soothing, depends on how high you push the intensity, vibration that conditions your nervous system. And you guys like numbers. Let me throw out some numbers. It's been proven in multiple clinical trials and real world studies. Apollo wearable users have experienced 40% less stress, 19% more time in deep sleep on average, 11% increase in HRV, which is heart rate variability, and up to 25% more focus and concentration. Apollo is still a new technology. A lot of people don't know about it. I'm thrilled to bring this to you. It is absolutely phenomenal. You can get yours. Go to apolloneuro.com/Dr. Lyon. That's apolloneuro.com/Dr. Lyon. And you will get $40 off the Apollo wearable. Dr. Darren Candow, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I am thrilled to have you. And we are going to learn all about creatine, who should take it, how much, and quite simply that it affects more than muscle. Isn't that true?
That's right. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and honored and super excited to talk about everything that's creatine.
Well, first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself and where you are in the world and what you're doing, because you've been certainly studying creatine for quite some time now.
Yeah, actually, I'm in British Columbia, Canada right now, but my university is in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, a couple provinces over. And God, I guess I've been doing this now for 2 decades. And I think creatine has kind of taken on a new life of its own. We'll probably talk about why that is. And why it's probably not just for athletes anymore. I think everybody on the planet could at least consider it. So lots to talk about. And I think it's more the health aspect. So very excited.
And first of all, what inspired you to begin focusing on creatine? Because that's quite niche. There's only, I would say, if we look in the literature, maybe there's, and correct me, 10 people that 10 or maybe 15 if we were lucky, that truly look at creatine and its impact on muscle, brain, bone, et cetera.
Yeah, that's right. Today, active researchers, there's a small few. But I got into creatine by accident. So as an aspiring graduate student, I did my master's on amino acid glutamine. And back then we were thinking, we heard a lot of people say glutamine was really beneficial for recovery and things like that. And I did my master's thesis on glutamine, and it had no effect on body composition or strength. And as a graduate student, you're very dejected. You're like, oh God, am I even going to pass my thesis? And then we've come to learn, well, it's a non-essential amino acid. It kind of makes sense. It's kind of useless from a muscle growth perspective. And at the same time, I had a colleague, Dr. Darren Burke, who's now gone into industry. He was interested in the compound called creatine. And when he was doing his studies, he was finding very good statistical results with good effect sizes. And as working out myself, I've heard about creatine, and I sort of branched off to something that seemed to be more attractive at the time. And then we started to introduce the idea into aging and young females and older females. And that's really where it's taken off. So I kind of got into it by a little bit of accident, but I'm really glad I did.
Basically, you rejected glutamine, which I think is fascinating. Glutamine has a very interesting role in immune function. And so I feel bad for glutamine, but I'm very excited about the work that you're doing in creatine. And for the listener, What is creatine? If you could just break down what it is, where it's found.
Yeah, it's a nitrogen containing compound we're naturally producing in reactions in the liver and brain. We produce about maybe 1 to 3 grams. 3 grams would be for those have a higher genetic variability. But a lot of people don't know we can actually consume it in the diet without a supplement. So if you consume red meat, seafood, or poultry, you're consuming about 1 to 2 grams a day. Now, if you're a vegan, vegetarian, you're not consuming any, whereas you're on a carnivore diet, you're consuming at the high end. So when you add those two together, and we also excrete some creatine through our urine as a byproduct of creatinine, and we can probably talk about a false positive that a lot of people should tell their doctor when they go. But that's why I think supplementation has become so popular because some research in the late 1990s simply showed that if you increase this nitrogen-containing compound naturally, you can get some beneficial effects. Very similar to protein when it comes into the body. That's why I think the safety profile of creatine is just like protein. It's very safe, very effective, and it's kind of like a little protein molecule, but doesn't have the same effects as protein.
And it's fascinating because a nitrogen containing compound, it doesn't actually promote muscle growth. Is that true?
That's
And
correct.
and that's interesting. Oftentimes when we think about amino acids, we do think about the necessity of these nitrogen containing compounds. What does it do in the body? Where is it found and what does it do?
Yeah, it's very unique. It seems to bypass the acidic environment of the stomach, and it gets into the bloodstream intact. And if we go back to even our high school biology, it was discovered in 1832, but creatine really helps maintain adenosine triphosphate, or the energy currency of all our cells. So, when we're performing activities of daily living, exercise, shoveling the driveway here in Canada, whatever it is, you're using ATP inside your muscles. And if we can sort of prolong our ability to exercise at higher intensities, creatine really sort of sacrifices itself. It really maintains the energy currency of our cells. And that's why it became so popular for athletes. But now we have new research to suggest not only does it enhance energy, but it has a whole plethora of other effects in the cell, including bone and brain, and probably why it's become such a hot topic for overall longevity and health purposes.
That's quite fascinating. And I'm assuming that the influence and the amount needed to get through the blood brain barrier and also affect bone is probably likely much higher than what would be needed for skeletal muscle. In muscle, creatine is important for what you said, energy.
Mhm.
In bone, what is its impact on bone?
So it's very similar. So it seems to act as a fuel source, like fuel for your vehicle. Our osteoblast cells are these cells that help build up the bone. They use creatine for energy. And of course, if they have more energy to put calcium and phosphate salts into the matrix of your skeleton, that's probably why we're starting to see some positive effects, especially in females. But it also seems to reduce bone breakdown. It's kind of like a bisphosphonate given to someone at pre-risk for osteopenia or osteoporosis. So it sort of acts as a fuel. In muscle, there's about 10 things that we think creatine does. And then in the brain, it also has a different effects. But one unique common denominator, it seems to have an anti inflammatory effect to all three of those tissues, which is sort of an emerging area. Does it act like an Advil or Tylenol? Kinda, but it seems to sort of preserve or create a more favorable environment for our cells to not only exercise at a higher volume, but also to recover faster.
And when you mention anti-inflammatory effect, what marker or
We
what markers are you
Yeah,
thinking
in
of?
muscle, it's cytokines. We'll measure tumor necrosis factor alpha or interleukin 6. But in the brain, they'll primarily measure mitochondrial oxidative stress. Primarily, obviously, done in rodents is very tough to measure in brain tissue from an ethical standpoint,
We don't
or
recommend that.
exactly, or into the brain. So it seems to have those effects. One of the big areas we really need to push forward, especially from female health, is seeing does creatine accumulate in bone tissue. But to do bone biopsies is very, very difficult. There's only a few labs in the world that do that. But we have a really good idea on the effects on muscle. And each tissue is different and may require a different dose. So we can probably talk about some of those questions today.
I would love to. Is there a genetic threshold for someone who is eating, for example, creatine? You said that the body makes 1 to 3 grams, likely depending on the size or the person. But is there a genetic threshold, or are some people say, resistant?
So there is technically a genetic threshold. The series of studies done in the late 1990s clearly showed our body can hold about 120 to about 160 millimoles or grams of creatine in our muscle. Now, if you get larger muscles, you can store more. Think of your living room. Maybe the living room is 3/4 full of creatine. If you take a supplement, it's completely full. However, there are outliers. And when you look at all those seminal studies, the average weight was about 70 to 80 kilograms. Now we have professional athletes, 100, 120 kilograms. And in one of those individuals in 1992, he was able to get his creatine up to 190 grams. So I think as the body has evolved, training techniques, I think there's an indirect ceiling, but I think we can push past that. And one of the best ways is if you exercise. That seems to really enhance the ability to store more creatine.
Wow. And why is that?
Well, one of the big things is just like if you understand the principles for those listening about glucose and GLUT4 transport proteins getting into our cell, when you exercise, you stimulate blood flow and these little doorways that allow creatine in. So, for anybody listening, if you're asking what's the best way to get creatine into our muscle faster, I say exercise. Don't worry about carbohydrates and protein and all that other stuff. I think creatine or exercise has been one of the best things to stimulate it. So exercise is foundational, and then creatine can hopefully give a small greater effect.
And would that be through natural production, or are you talking about oral supplementation and diet?
It's through a combination of diet, supplementation, and natural production. But in those studies, it was in the presence of a supplementation. So 5 gram dose of creatine is found in probably about 1 kilogram of a steak or seafood. So the cost of groceries, ethical treatment of animals, whatever your preference, it may be something to consider from a supplementation perspective. But those studies all base it on the powder, the boring white powder of creatine. Yeah.
And how much, and this just makes me think about when we design a diet for optimizing longevity and aging. If what I'm hearing you say that individuals make creatine and that supplementation isn't per se necessary, but could be important if you don't eat red meat or don't eat fish. If someone was designing a diet, how much protein in one day, if your goal would be to not just target muscle at 5 grams of creatine a day or 3 to 5, depending male, female, I'm sure you'll tell me if that matters, if the sex matters, but we want to target bone and brain.
Yes.
How much in one day would someone need to eat?
Yeah, and that's an excellent segue because I think creatine can be considered conditionally essential for those who don't have a lot of protein or red meat or things in their diet, or aging does have a negative effect. So I personally take 10 grams for a whole body. So the way I sort of justify this is you're right, 3 to 5 grams is plenty for muscle. Like you could go as little as 3, probably even a little bit less. That's plenty for muscle because we only have so much room. The problem is if 95% of the creatine is stored in muscle, you only have less than 5% trickling to the brain and or bone. And one of the theories in the research studies suggesting a longer dosing protocol or higher dose to now have more accumulating in the brain and the bone. So I personally take 10 grams, but a fascinating study just came out 2 days ago where they gave a really mega dose. And it was the first time one single dose, it was about 30 grams, could actually accumulate in the brain using MRS, which is the gold standard. It's like the MRI for muscle, but during times of metabolic stress. So I'm sure we'll talk about who should expect benefits from a cognitive perspective, who shouldn't. But if you're really sleep deprived and things, I think the brain can sort of take in more creatine because it's demanding.
Thank you to Timeline Nutrition for sponsoring this episode of the show. You've heard me talk about MitoPure before. MitoPure is incredible. If you are not taking it and have not tried it, this is the one supplement that I hear my patients come back to me and say, I have more energy. MitoPure is a clinically tested form of urolithin A. Urolithin A is a postbiotic, and only 30 to 40% of people can actually make it from the foods that they eat within their gut microbiome. This does a few things. It helps energy generating mitochondria. It also improves strength and endurance, specifically in people that are middle-aged. Who doesn't want more of that? There are many different ways to take MitoPure. You can mix MitoPure berry or ginger powder into your yogurt. They have a vanilla protein shake with MitoPure. I personally use their soft gels, super easy to travel with. Get yours at timelinenutrition.com/Dr. Lyon. That's timelinenutrition.com/Dr. Lyon to get 10% off your order.
We did a study with long COVID, and it really showed that the brain was really sensitive to the peripheral amount of creatine. I don't know anybody that's not sleep deprived, especially in academia. So I think students studying for exams, you flying to Europe, you get off the plane jet lag. These are times where I think this metabolite could really play a role. And they're starting to look at some Alzheimer's research now in the States. So I think there's a huge explosion coming up. Yeah.
When you think about a whole foods diet, would that mean if an individual didn't want to take a supplementation, that potentially lean red meats would be the best source?
Yeah, lean red meats or seafood. Seafood will have the highest concentration per dose. Poultry has a lot less, so red meat or seafood will get you there. However, if you're just looking at it from a muscle perspective, one serving a day with your natural synthesis might be enough. If you're looking at it from a greater perspective, so anybody on a carnivore diet, I would speculate they might not respond at all to supplementation because they're taking in a lot. But if you have a naturally high rate of endogenous production, you eat 1 or 2 servings of seafood or red meat a day, you may not experience any benefits noticeable from creatine and you're considered a non-responder. But I will say we only consider non-responders from a muscle perspective. I think the emergence on brain, the immune system, and bone is something that we'll have to definitely look at down the road.
And quite frankly, that's more exciting
Mhm.
because creatine in muscle has been studied for a really long time. I do love that you're bridging the gap in looking at, I have a 2-year randomized control trial on creatine supplementation during exercise for postmenopausal bone health. That I think the women going through perimenopause and menopause really have been underserved just in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Because creatine, let's be truthful, when you think about creatine, you probably think about the guys in the gym
Yeah.
and slamming it without water. At least I do. And really seeing the work that you're doing in women and also aging
Yeah. Yeah.
really seems to be important. People will ask, when is it too early to start, or is it never too early to start? I get a lot of questions from patients that have kids in high school. I live in Texas. Sports are big. Could a 16-year-old start with creatine? Would there be any negative impacts? Could it potentially be positive? And is there an accumulation over time?
Yeah.
For example,
Mhm.
if a 16-year-old starts with, let's say, 10 grams of creatine throughout their entire life, do they have an advantage?
Mhm.
Or is it short-lived, and is it just is the benefit just when an individual is taking it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So this answer sort of evolved. Typically, most studies are 18 and above, and you've hit the nail on the head. Primarily in young males. So the whole body of research in females is underrepresented, and it is emerging though. But then new data started to come out. Some great research in the USA talking about children and creatine, and then Stacey Ellery in Australia is now looking at it during pregnancy and for the fetal development. And we're starting to see problems there, primarily in the rodent, but it shows the bioenergetics. So the pregnancy, obviously, huge caution, but there's some promise. When we get into children, there's a bit more sound data there, and it seems to be very safe and very beneficial from a sports and health perspective. There's never been a study to look at blood biomarkers in children, but they're currently doing that now. To be honest, I would be shocked if there's any adverse effects at a 3 to 5 gram dose. It's very similar to protein when we consume it. The body sees it. If it doesn't like it, it just excretes it in the urine. But to your point, does it accumulate over time? We don't really know if you start too early, but my guess is it's probably never too early to consider it. If you're eating red meat or seafood as a child, it's going to accumulate. You get all of the other health benefits, including protein. But it does beg the question. We do know at higher dosages for long periods of time, there is a theory it could desensitize your doorways into the muscle. So that's where the question is, should I cycle it or should I take it continuously? There's no evidence to suggest one is better than the other. So we don't really know, do you downgrade your natural benefit? We do know taking it will not stop your natural production. That's been clear in humans. So I think it's something that's considered safe and a very viable intervention to at least consider over time.
And do we know if women or if children make the same 1 to 3 grams a day? Is it based on size, or is it just based on if someone is human or not?
Yeah, it's primarily that has come from adults, but it does extrapolate down to the child. And then again, the dosage, if it was 3 to 5 grams, or we use a relative dose, 0.1 gram per kilogram. So, if the child's 40 kilograms, it's 4 grams a day if they're larger. Playing high school football in Texas, some of these individuals are over 100 kilograms already. It's based on the size, but I think an absolute dose, low recommendation, 3 to 5 grams, it will accumulate. 3 grams will accumulate and fill up your muscle in 30 days, the same as the loading phase, with no adverse effects, including water retention. So it's really up to the individual how they want to achieve those benefits.
One is what I'm hearing you say, one would expect an improvement in performance if they are taking a dose that targets skeletal muscle within 30 days.
Yeah, that's at a low dose. Now, if they wanted to do the loading phase, you'll probably get those effects in about 5 days. So if you just say, I want to take 3 grams a day, you'll start to notice improvements maybe halfway through, but the muscle is going to be completely full at 30 days. So again, it's really how much patience you have.
And let's break down a myth really
Mhm.
quick. Does creatine affect fat loss?
So we published 2 meta-analyses over the last 2 years, and it was a bit surprising to me, to be honest, when we looked at all the data, creatine and resistance exercise compared to resistance exercise alone. In individuals 18 and above, there was a decrease, not an increase. There was a slight decrease in percent body fat. It was only about 1 to 1.5%. And then the absolute reduction was zero point 0.5 kilograms. So over time, is that meaningful? I guess you could say it didn't increase fat and it had a slight decrease. So for those individuals that are very hesitant, if you do take creatine and you notice that the number went up on the scale in the first week or so, please note it's highly probable it's water. Your body will adjust. And how do we know this? But when we do pre and post interventions, the weight is usually identical. Lean tissue or muscle mass typically goes up with creatine, and therefore you would speculate that might help explain why fat mass will go down. So I get a question by bodybuilders all the time. Can I take creatine before I'm doing a competition? I say absolutely. Not only will it increase the surface area of your muscle to potentially maintain training volume, but it could have an ability to improve aesthetics. I would not recommend the loading phase, which is 20 grams a day for about 5 to 7 days, unless you're an elite athlete. That's because that's where you can get into some issues with bloating, water retention, or acute increase in weight. And that's probably one of the main reasons young females do not like taking the loading phase. But for the Olympic athletes coming up to Paris, my guess is most will be peaking and trying to understand the principles of creatine before their big race or event. Yeah.
And just to be clear, what kind of exercise would creatine impact?
It used to only involve resistance exercise, and it primarily does for anaerobic based sports where you're exploding, sprinting, jumping. But all of a sudden, we have new emerging evidence that it can improve aspects of endurance or aerobic capacity, primarily reducing inflammation or improving their ability to perform sports such as soccer or swimming. So now we think creatine has application, if done properly, for any type of athletic events. But yes, 90% of the efficacy is based on weight training.
What you're saying also is that seems to be safe for everybody. Is there anyone that shouldn't take it?
I struggle to find anybody that shouldn't take it. The only subcategory is that if you have pre-existing renal or liver abnormalities, I would strongly caution you to consult with your doctor for 2 reasons. When you take creatine supplementation and it gets into the muscle, when it's broken down with weight training, it's broken down, not as creatine, but it's something called creatinine. And everybody's like, oh, I remember that. That's on my blood requisition form. And my doctor gets mad at me. My creatinine is high. So if you're considering creatine supplementation, please tell your nephrologist or GP you're taking supplementation. Typically, your creatinine will be high. That does not mean you're in renal failure. Where creatine is synthesized in reactions in the kidney or liver, it may make those organs work a little bit harder. So we always caution if you have any pre-existing genetic history of renal or liver abnormalities, please consult with your physician. But on the other hand, we just published that study you mentioned, 2 years in postmenopausal females, and we gave 11 grams a day for 2 straight years to a population that is genetically predisposed to have organ deterioration. And we measured renal and liver enzymes every year, and there was no difference. So we're very confident now that even a high dose of creatine can be excreted very healthily through the body. And that's why most consider creatine to be the safest, most effective ergogenic aid to date, even more than caffeine.
Which, again, creatine has been around for a very long time. We're talking a lot about muscle. What about its impact on the brain, the dosage,
Yes.
and how long it would take for dietary or supplementation, the supplementation of creatine to impact brain in a meaningful way? And you had mentioned children. Does it help with ADHD? Does it help with spatial processing, et cetera, memory?
Yeah, it's an emerging area, and the dosing strategies are evolving, and almost on a daily basis, they seem to change a little bit. But in summary, it can have beneficial effects to many aspects of the brain. The brain uses 20% of our energy throughout the day. So when you're metabolically stressed, studying, flying, whichever it is, our brain is using a lot of creatine, just like our muscle for ATP. But unlike muscle, which acts as a vacuum and sucks in a lot of creatine from the blood, as you already mentioned, the blood has this really important blood-brain barrier. And it says, whoa, 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 we make our own creatine. Why would we need any from the blood? Go to muscle or bone. We don't need you. However, sleep deprivation, hypoxia, elderly individuals, or any type of metabolic stress, we're now starting to see really good evidence using magnetic resonance spectroscopy that creatine can accumulate. And based on the totality of evidence, you need a higher dose than muscle or a longer period of time. So I'll break it into two strategies. You can probably take about 4 to 5 grams a day, but you're going to need successive weeks or months to accumulate. You can take 20 grams a day for about 7 days, and that's been shown to accumulate. That study released the other day, you could take 30 grams in one mega dose. That's been shown to get in, but I don't know if that's very viable on a daily basis. My guess is you would probably get some GI tract irritation. There has been some minimal evidence in children, but only from a post concussion recovery aspect. But to your memory about memory and spatial organization, that's primarily found during sleep deprivation in older adults, where when they were sleep deprived or assessed on cognition, they seem to improve memory. But if the brain is not stressed, we're not seeing any benefits. Mm.
There may not be any benefit to taking creatine. If someone is training hard and not sleeping, let's say a military or an academic
Mhm.
who has to get in a grant proposal,
Right.
I'm sure you know a few of those, and is on a deadline, would they require more? If they are training really hard and they're utilizing creatine on a daily basis, would they need more to get to the blood-brain barrier above and beyond, say, that 10 grams? Would there be, do those patients or those people need 30
Yeah,
grams?
it's very logical to say yes, because if they're training more at a higher intensity, the muscle will extract and metabolize more, and then you might have less going to the brain. But the whole area right now is in France last summer. And for those athletes like soccer or professional football, in the third quarter or the second half of the game, when they're really cognitively fatigued, maybe creatine can allow them to focus near the end of a game or with the Olympics coming up. So the theory is that the more training you do or the more metabolically stressed, and that's what that study just clearly showed, you may need more. Can you take 20 grams of creatine or 30 in one dose? I don't think that's very viable. I think you need to titrate it and break it up into more frequent dosages. And we have 4 studies that are being upcoming to look at is more smaller frequent dosage is better. But I think to your point, the more intense your training, as you get older, you may need more. Just like if we brought in protein, it's the same analogy. Anabolic resistance. Is there anabolic resistance with creatine? It's logical because they sort of understand the same principle. And that's why we gave such a high dose in those postmenopausal females. We speculated the catastrophic effects of aging muscle loss could sort of require more in the diet.
Thank you to Mudwater for sponsoring this episode of the show. If you have not heard about Mudwater, you definitely should know about it. It is my favorite alternative to hot chocolate. And by the way, it tastes incredible. It has a hint of cacao and cinnamon and this chai type flavor. Not only that, but it has 4 functional mushrooms in it. It has a fraction of the caffeine that I typically use in the afternoon. It allows me to have a kind of natural energy. I'm not having jitters. I'm not up till 1 or 2 in the morning because I made a bad decision later on in the afternoon. Cacao and chai for the hint of caffeine. Lion's mane for focus. Cordyceps to promote natural energy. It has chaga and reishi for immune system support. It's 100% organic, non-GMO, gluten-free, and kosher. Mudwater also donates monthly to support psychedelic research. Very kind that they give back. You can try Mudwater for $29 a month. That is less than $1 a cup when you go to mudwater.com/Dr. Lyon, mudwtr.com/Dr. Lyon. I absolutely agree with you. When you think about creatine and protein, I often think about them in the same way regarding a dose response, regarding anabolic resistance and sarcopenia. When it comes to having a synergistic effect, for example, collagen has a synergistic effect with vitamin C. You're speaking about creatine, and I'm assuming you're speaking about creatine monohydrate. I think that's really important to point out. People will ask, what kind of creatine should we use? Is there a difference? So my first question is, what kind of creatine? Is there a difference? And does creatine work in synergy with something else?
Yeah. So as I sit here today, only focus on monohydrate for 2 reasons. Creatine monohydrate means one water molecule linked to creatine. When you digest it, the water molecules dissolved, and it's identical to what the liver and brain is producing. So that's probably why it's so safe. And all the research will suggest that monohydrate is the safest and most effective. All the marketed forms of creatine come down to one thing. It has to be creatine to get in the blood. And I really am speculative or hesitant that all these marketed forms that are super expensive do any better, because the bioavailability of creatine monohydrate is near 100%. So I think for anybody listening, please focus on monohydrate. And that would be the big push there. And then
sorry, go ahead.
And just repeat part 2 so I don't mess it up.
Is there a synergistic effect of creatine in something else? Because again, we're, just like in Don's research, typically they look at an individual amino acid, or they'll look at, a formulation of individual amino acids. And quite frankly, looking at creatine doesn't exist in nature. No one is going out there to the fields and picking a flower of creatine. It doesn't exist like that. It exists in a matrix.
Right.
So I'm curious as if there is something within a food matrix that makes creatine more potent or has somewhat of a synergistic effect from a brain, bone, or muscle perspective.
So we'll talk about one, but we'll talk about a better one shortly that'll be dire to your heart. So it's well established that high glycemic carbohydrates can really augment the effect of carbohydrate into the muscle. But the dangers of simple processed refined sugars, and a lot of people don't like that. But luckily for everybody, the protein is very gluconeogenic. It will stimulate insulin. And my God, as you know, we get so many health benefits from protein. And luckily, there's been a few studies in younger individuals and older adults, which we've done. And we combined creatine and protein. It was a whey-based protein. So think of milk or dairy as the main source, high concentration of leucine. And when creatine was combined with protein, it increased muscle mass and muscle strength more than creatine or protein alone. So I always take creatine in my Greek yogurt. I make a really high protein breakfast in the morning, and I'll put 5 grams of creatine in about a 50 to 60 gram protein breakfast. And then I'll take 5 grams with water during my workout. So I sort of like the idea of the synergistic effects. Without boring the viewers, it had something to do with the transcription of DNA to RNA. Protein has been shown to increase the rates of protein synthesis. Might be a surprise to people, but creatine has never been shown to directly stimulate protein synthesis. It does a lot of other things like satellite cells. But when you add the two, you get a synergistic effect. So I think it's something to consider. people might say, oh, wait a minute, isn't protein and creatine in red meat and seafood? I'm like, absolutely. If you don't want to take a supplement, you can emphasize those on a diet. And this sort of leads into vacation. If I'm traveling, you don't want to take your gummies or candy or powder across the board or whichever. I say easy. When you're at a restaurant or on vacation, maybe emphasize more red meat or seafood, and that'll help maintain those two important products in your diet, and that'll help maintain those levels over time. The issue comes down to what about the vegans and vegetarians? That's where they can get the protein. They just need to eat a bit more, but they're going to really struggle to get the dietary creatine. And that's probably the area where supplementation would be considered.
And we don't know any, again, the body makes creatine, but I'm sure that the human biology is designed for a more optimal level. That maybe that's fair to say. Maybe I'm extrapolating too much, but it seems as if we can think about a minimum effective dose, maybe what the body makes, and then a more optimal dose would certainly be choosing foods that are higher in creatine. I find it interesting that fish has creatine because the tissue between fish and meat is different.
Yeah, it's interesting thing, and some of the highest concentrations are in herring, mackerel, and salmon, and then of course seafood will give you the omega threes at high dosages, and there's a big push behind that as well. And I'm going back to your point about looking at the natural synthesis for a lot of people. For those that have fully saturated their muscle, please note it takes about a month for those levels to come back to baseline. And then in the brain, it takes about 5 weeks. So if someone says, hey, I've been supplementing with creatine for 4 or 5 months and I'm going away for a month, rest assured, when you come back, those levels should be still elevated. Once it gets into the cell, creatine becomes too big, it becomes trapped, and the diffusion rate is very, very slow.
And when you take it, you actually break it up. You have some in the morning and some during a workout. What is the evidence to support that that should be taken that way?
Yeah.
When should someone take creatine?
Yeah.
Does it need to be taken with food?
Right.
Does it need to be taken intra-workout, before bed?
Yeah, there's evidence to all those points. I think the landmark study was by Roger Harris, who's the landmark pioneer, and Eric Holtman, and he showed that very, very small dosages of creatine, as little as 1 gram, but 20 times a day. Now, I don't know how feasible that is for everybody to set the alarm clock, but they showed that more smaller, frequent dosages seem to get retained and absorbed more in the body. So you'd have less being excreted. And if more is being retained, it's logical more could be going to your demanding tissues. So I think it's just like a mega bolus dose of protein, independent of that Lawrence 100-gram study he just did with protein. We still think that the protein distribution or pacing that you and Don have talked about many times, that's probably logical to creatine as well. Taking a smaller amount may cause an increase in absorption. So again, we have studies upcoming to look at that, and these are going to be in older adults. So we're super excited to finally get some new data out. So that's the theory with that, more retention. And it might be easier from a GI tract. When we get into high dosages in a single bolus, we have heard incidences of people say they suffer some GI tract irritation. So I've often recommend, hey, divide it up into many dosages with food. We find when you combine the powder in food, less adverse effects, less water retention. So whatever strategy those individuals can do, the timing is irrelevant. We think post-exercise may be ideal, but at the end of it, it's not like caffeine. I think you can take creatine at any other time of the day. And really, it's whatever's convenient for you to maintain compliance.
And is the timing? I can appreciate that it's irrelevant, but if perhaps someone was in a more catabolic
Mhm.
state or hypocaloric, would it make sense because blood flow is now increased to tissue
Yeah,
that
so
perhaps the delivery of creatine would be improved?
that's 100% correct. So I usually recommend in close proximity to exercise. So before, during, or after, it makes sense. Obviously, blood flow kinetics to the muscle, and it's going to stimulate the muscle to take it in. So it's one of those strategies we propose in many papers now. We think that's very beneficial. Is it better than in the morning or evening? We're not sure yet, but we have that study actually upcoming. So that's a very viable and effective strategy. But you sort of stole one of my ideas that I've been thinking is like, what about this anti-catabolic effects of creatine? What about for all those individual athletes or those on a hypocaloric diet or during fasting? We know if you increase protein, that can sort of overcompensate for the loss. maybe creatine and protein would give you a better effect. So the study I would love to do is those on a hypocaloric diet or fasting or bed rest, look at protein and creatine together versus creatine only versus protein only to see, can one of these be very effective. My hope is you maintain or increase muscle while dieting and potentially lose a little bit of adipose tissue. The big study that I think needs to be done is, can creatine rescue the fat or the muscle loss from Ozempic and semaglutide? That'll be a big push, the big loss of fat. But can we take something that can preserve muscle? That's my brain going down the road that I think could help longevity.
And that would be very interesting, because I don't know of any anabolic effect of creatine per se. For example, leucine in muscle protein synthesis, we can appreciate that mechanism of action. The mechanism of action from a creatine standpoint, is there one that would perpetuate or prevent a catabolic activity in tissue?
Yeah, so there's a few from a catabolic perspective. It seems to decrease the rates of whole body protein breakdown. So that might have implications for those bed rests or going through excessive exercise training. It also seems to reduce reactive oxidative species or oxidative stress. So both of those are accelerated during the aging process and accelerated during intense exercise. So some really good evidence to support those. From an anabolic perspective, you're right. It doesn't stimulate the rates of myofibrillar protein synthesis, but it certainly increases IGF-1, satellite cells, transcription factors, and some of the proteins in the mTOR pathway. We are upcoming a study to look at the rates of myofibrillar or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which probably makes more sense. I've talked to Mike Roberts in Auburn about this. If creatine is osmotic and it will swell the cell, that stimulates protein synthesis indirectly. So I think it works kind of like the caramel secret in a magical way, but it hasn't been shown to increase actin-myosin protein synthesis yet. And again, you've already sort of touched on lean tissue. One of the big downfalls of measuring lean tissue is, at best 50% might be dry muscle. So we need to do more direct imaging with biopsy and protein tracers. But I'm sure it's coming. But since it's just made up of 3 amino acids, it's probably likely it wouldn't increase protein synthesis because you need those essential amino acids in the whole amount to be there. So at the end of it seems to be advantageous. I think cake is exercise. Protein is the very nice icing on it, and then sprinkles on top of the cake, maybe creatine or omega-3. So it may provide a small beneficial effect.
And now I'm going to throw a wrench into it, because I had 4 groups of individuals that I wanted to talk about. And the next group, hypocaloric was one of them. The next group is a sedentary individual. Would a sedentary individual with no glycogen flux, very minimal activity, which I consider sedentary behavior to be a disease state, would creatine have any impact on a sedentary individual?
Yeah, there's about 10 studies to suggest there is some from a muscle perspective, and the majority are in older adults. However, they were still performing activities of daily living, and it only seems to have a beneficial effect primarily from a muscle performance perspective. It's well been shown without an exercise intervention in the study to have massive improvements in young individuals. But again, are they working out? So to answer your question, from pure bed rest, we don't know. And that's the study we propose, and we're trying to get funding for that.
You make a really important point that I would love to highlight, that you'd mentioned it can improve, quote, lean tissue.
Mhm.
People often correlate lean tissue with skeletal muscle mass. And what Darren is saying is they are not the same. I think this has been a huge failure in the scientific community, not by anyone's fault. It's very difficult to measure at a population basis skeletal
Mhm.
muscle, but they are not the same. Lean tissue and skeletal muscle mass are not the same. I'm very interested in D3 creatine
Yes.
as a way of looking at skeletal muscle mass. I'm sure you're interested and probably will be instituting that in hopefully some of your studies.
Yeah, it's you make a really good point. I have a conference next week in New Mexico, and Bill Evans will be there, and he's kind of come up with the D3. So we've at these conferences on sarcopenia, the whole theory is, can we use D3 creatine based on the creatine molecule, because it's primarily in muscle. Of course, minimal limitation with bone and brain turnover. But you're right that the problem is we always use DEXA or BIA we did put out a small meta-analysis, Brad Schoenfeld, last year, and the effect size on direct measures of muscle mass, only using a CT or ultrasound, the effect size was average. It was about 30% more direct imaging of muscle in combination with weight training, of course. But again, there's limitations with that as well. You got to do MRI biopsies and do a 3 or 4 compartment model. So when people say they put on muscle mass, it's okay for the average person to think that. For the scientists, we know it's probably not the case. At best, my guess is if you put on a kilogram of lean mass, maybe 500 grams of that is dry muscle if you're working out. But you're right, it's very difficult to do. Yeah.
As we get more nuanced and capable, I really believe that we will do this. I actually haven't mentioned this, but I'm going to be going back into research, and we're going to look retrospectively at testosterone and some other hormones with D3 creatine. Yeah. Pretty cool.
It is, absolutely. It's an emerging area. It's super fascinating. Yeah.
In terms of sarcopenia, what is creatine's impact on sarcopenia if an individual begins taking creatine early? Do we know, is there a prevention? Does it affect the tissue?
Yeah, we don't know if it's a prevention, but we've proposed it, and many times, to be a potential anti-sarcopenic intervention in combination with exercise. So sarcopenia is now diagnosed by reduction in strength, then muscle and or lean mass, and then functionality. And in several meta-analyses, creatine has been shown to improve all 3 of those facets. The big limitation is that it's never been shown in a population diagnosed with sarcopenia at a large scale. So we typically measure this in healthy individuals who may not have sarcopenia, and just because their strength in that went up. But there is logic and theory that it could have some anti-sarcopenic effects. But the only way to really answer your question is you need to take a large sample, diagnosed with all 3 of those caveats, and then see the creatine have any greater effect than placebo. So it's likely there, but it needs to be done from a clinical randomized control trial.
And in your data, when you're looking at biomarkers of creatine, are you looking at creatinine? Are you looking at anything else?
We look at many things. So creatinine, serum creatinine, obviously is the big one from a filtration rate. But from a liver or kidney health aspect, we look at many other facets that way. We do measure intramuscular creatine from the biopsy, so total and then phosphocreatine. And then I'm working with a colleague in Norway to look at getting into the brain. But we'll look at those high energy metabolites. But from a turnover perspective, it's usually just creatinine.
Thank you to Inside Tracker for sponsoring this episode of the show. I know that I always harp on blood work, and the reason I've partnered with Inside Tracker is because blood work is critical. You cannot be successful in your health journey without knowing what is going on under the hood. You do need to know where your thyroid is at. You do need to know where your blood glucose is at, your insulin, your ApoB, the list goes on. Inside Tracker is a direct consumer blood work company that not only has blood work, but it also analyzes your DNA and your fitness tracking data. It allows you to take control of your own health. We always hear about this N of 1 thing. Well, this is your own experiment, and it is also your responsibility to know what is going on within your body. Inside Tracker has offered my listeners 20% off the entire Inside Tracker store. Do not wait. It is your time. It is very easy to use. If you are a healthcare professional, they also have Inside Tracker Pro, where you can interface with your clients. All of this is 20% off. Go to insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon. That's insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon for 20% off. And doesn't matter the fiber type. I don't want to get too crazy about the fiber types, but does that influence the amount of creatine that's stored?
Yeah, it was really elegantly shown that the larger type 2 fibers are the ones you use for weightlifting. And
when you're buff,
that's
those
right.
fibers, people, you better be resistant to training.
Exactly. Those are the ones we need and use often. And unfortunately, we have this denervation process, usually starting in the 5th decade or more. Unfortunately, our muscle fibers sort of go away, they decrease. And when we say that, we mean these large muscle fibers we used primarily at a young age. And that's where creatine is primarily stored. So for anybody listening, I don't care your age, please exercise. Focus on both, but weight training is probably going to be one of your better things for longevity. And as we get older, You need to ensure you never miss leg day. I know that's hard to believe because that's where the largest muscles are. And we've shown in the lower body, creatine kinetics is more negatively affected. But weight training seems to be the fountain of youth. And a supplement or a dietary intervention, if that can help. But I think exercise seems to act as the trigger from a longevity perspective.
How much exercise?
So I know the government in Canada and the US will say 2 sessions, a week, and I'm fine with that.
Abysmal.
I'm fine with that at the start out, but they also recommend 150 minutes of cardiovascular exercise a week, and I would certainly like to have more weight training sessions. But if you can get 2 sessions in a week, and you last week you did nothing, that's fantastic. But really good evidence has shown from Stu Phillips, Brett Schoenfeld, and other people like that. 3 sessions a week is plenty. And if you're getting an individual 70, 80 years older that's exercising with weight training 3 times a week, they're going to be in a very unique population where they're likely putting on age or years to life and age expectancy and living longer free of disease. And if they have inadequate nutrition, I think it's a foundational aspect for youth. You're never too old to start. You can have a centurion exercise. And I think that's the crucial aspect. People come to us a lot to say, what pill or powder can I take and watch Netflix for 4 hours a night and not? And I said, no, you got to exercise to primarily unlock the benefits. Yeah.
Does the volume matter? The volume of the training? What about the exertion, the load?
Yeah. You must have broken into my office because we literally have that study in review. So based on the kinetics of creatine, we theorize that creatine can help increase exercise volume by either doing more sets, reps, or recovery. So if the individual can train longer or intensely in each session over time, that's probably what's helping maintain or creating those anabolic effects, strength, endurance, whichever. And so we think it has applications for everybody to try to improve overall health. Yeah.
And in terms of creatine stores and utilization, that would be more intense exercise. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That is correct. The more anaerobic it is or more effort you're putting in, that's where the muscle creatine stores will be turned over faster. If it's too easy, your creatine will be minimally activated, but you're going to rely more on glycolysis of carbohydrate or beta oxidation from fat. So if you're going out for a walk with your spouts at lunch, you're not using creatine, you're going to be using adipose tissue stores. But if you say, I'm doing HIIT class or really intense weight training, that's where creatine really seems to be very favorable.
This is where I feel that all the zone two training is having its moment right now. And I have to say that there's other ways in which you can improve VO2 max. And when you do these harder things that you're talking about, the benefit also relates to skeletal muscle health, maintenance, potentially even growth, and creatine.
Yeah.
You're not going to get the same influence from slow, steady state zone 2 training over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a Peloton, and for me to do a zone 2 training when the person's yelling at me, I find I can't do it. I need to go as hard as I can. And I have good colleagues here in Canada that have looked at the HIIT model, Marty Cabala, John Little, your PGC1 alpha and GLUT4, they all go up in a time restricted pattern. And I think everybody's so busy. And I understand the principles of zone 2 training with mitochondrial biogenesis. But for me, and I think you would agree, as you get older, you got to sort of step it up a little bit to maintain those type 2 fibers, which gets often overlooked with type 2 training. And I'm a big proponent on zone 10, whatever you want to call it. I really like the high intensity. I like high intensity weightlifting and high intensity cardiovascular exercise. I personally get more out of it, but I know there's a huge push on zone 2 training. All training is beneficial. Is one better than the other? I lean towards HIIT. I think the more intense you go, the body will respond better. But I'm not aware if someone said I've taken zone 2 and I don't even know if it's zone 5. I don't even know what it's called, but more intense. Yeah.
And we have to appreciate that we're not actually going to exercise to become good at exercise.
Right. Exactly.
We're going to train because we're looking for an adaptation. We're looking to be more functional and capable in life. Zone 2 training arguably is not going to do it. But if you get out there and you do some kind of high intensity interval training, you really push yourself both mentally and physically, the outcomes are better.
Yeah, I like all the cellular data sort of implicating the higher the intensity is better from a molecular standpoint, especially around the telomeres and the mitochondrial enzymes. And I think that's hugely important for healthy aging.
Which leads me to my fourth group. We talked about hypocaloric individuals, those trying to lose weight, sedentary individuals, sarcopenic individuals, and now postmenopausal.
Yeah, it's a pride of ours in our lab, and we sort of focused on this amazing population. Those participants are outstanding, and one of the main reasons we focus on postmenopause is because they have the highest prevalence and risk of osteoporosis due to the cessation of estrogen. And when we've looked at a few studies now, creatine supplementation, we gave 0.1 to 0.14 grams. So this is a bit interesting. That average was about 8 to 11 grams a day during 1 and 2 years of exercise. The 2 year model looked at 6 days of brisk walking and 3 days a week of supervised weight training. And at the end of the day, 2 years of exercising and a higher dose of creatine, it preserved or had some favorable effects on bone mineral and bone geometry at the hip region. It also improved lean tissue and gait speed. But focusing on the crucial importance of bone, we focused on the hip because if you were to fall and suffer hip replacement surgery or a fracture, you could be immobilized for up to a year, and that leads to a lot of chronic diseases. And these young or postmenopausal females, the average age was about 57 and above, and they were cessation of their menstrual cycle for at least 12 months. It really seemed to have some benefits around the hip region, where unfortunately for the females who even exercise, they got a reduction. So clearly showing that the biological process of aging is there. Exercise has to be there because you would immediately speculate, oh my God, what if you had a group who did nothing? That would be a clinically significant loss of bone mineral. So please, exercise has to be there. Creatine may provide a small beneficial effect. We maintain protein in their diet normally, and they were above the RDA, but not by much. So that leads to speculation. We got to get that protein dose. I agree with you and Don and Stu Phillips and everybody. Like, it's almost criminal. 0.8 grams for an older adult. I love the confidence interval going all the way up to 2.2, or in Canada, a gram per pound. But the 1.2 to 1.6, that's double. We got to almost think that's the base. And so nutrition is really important. Of course, exercise is foundation.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. It is criminal. These recommendations have not been changed for decades at zero point 0.8 grams. And we also have to appreciate that zero point 0.8 grams per kg, this was developed on younger males also that were eating only high quality
Right.
proteins.
Yeah.
A lot of discussion. Could someone be plant-based? Could you do make those kinds of choices? You could, but as total calorie consumption goes down, the quality of the protein really needs to go up.
Right.
There was a French group that did, it was a proof of concept, and it talked about how that as an individual were to lower their protein, these were postmenopausal women, similar to the age in your study, I think they were 59 years old, maybe even a little bit older, is that as their dietary protein consumption went down, the quality of the protein needed to go up
Yes.
to make up for these other physiological needs,
Yep.
whether it was zinc, B12,
Yeah.
iron, etc.
It's to get the leucine threshold and to get the adequate amount of. And also, when you talk to people that are eating more protein, they have less refined processed carbohydrates coming in, less saturated fat, trans fat. So, there's no downside of increasing protein. It's used for enzymes and hormones and a lot of other things. It's not just for muscle. If you're taking it a little bit more, it doesn't really get converted to fat, and it just gives a number of other health benefits I think get often overlooked. And Dawn's clearly shown, and you've talked about it many times, a high protein breakfast and maybe one at supper. That's two viable strategies to get the amount of protein. But the 70 kilogram individual and the government saying 56 grams of protein is all we think you need is, studies have come out, if you're less than one, you're almost going to get sarcopenia later on in life, and that leads to frailty and cachexia. So we just got to get the message out more. In your book, obviously, and you're doing amazing things. I think people are aware of the protein. I understand the cost of food nowadays. When people go to Costco and chicken and salmon was, $20 and now it's 40. It's very difficult, but we got to try to find any way we can. If they are vegan or vegetarian, just eat more quality based proteins that way and get to that leucine threshold. We saw in a paper with Hamilton and Rochelle in Brazil about 8 grams seems to be the minimal amount of leucine even for older adults. So you can get there. It takes a little bit of work, but for those eating a balanced carnivore or an omnivore diet, I think you can easily make some strategic choices that way to get it. But it's really critical. Yeah.
Are there any behaviors that we do that could affect our ability to produce creatine?
So Exercise won't actually increase our ability to store creatine. We thought it could, but it would make sense, but it doesn't. It just helps maintain it. And the only thing that we think can, well, besides genetics, is actually looking at a few things. Physical activity will maintain it. So that's got to be there. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but physical activity has got to be foundational. Um, but the biological sex of the individual is an interesting one. There's been a few studies to suggest that the amount of creatine in biological females in their muscle may be a little bit higher at starting levels because their muscles may be a little bit smaller. So the concentration. So they may not respond as well as biological males from a muscle growth perspective. We do see many studies that do show beneficial effects. They certainly get massive beneficial effects from a muscle and bone perspective, and we certainly see the benefits in the brain. So there was a small sort of emphasis that maybe females may not respond as well. I can see why some people may speculate that, but we're not really seeing the effects. So biological males, females, whoever it is on the planet, you should expect some type of benefit. If it's not from muscle, it may benefit your bone. If it's not in muscle and bone, it may benefit your cognition. So for whatever perspective, I think anybody on the planet may experience some benefits to creatine over time, either through the diet or supplementation.
You wrote a really wonderful review, and it's called Creatine Supplementation in Women's Health: A Lifespan Perspective. And there's a statement here. It says creatine characteristics vary between males and females, with females exhibiting 70 to 80% lower endogenous creatine stores compared to males. Does that still hold true?
It can, unless the female is getting larger muscles. So that was based on baseline, looking at all the muscle amount over time. And there's a couple theories why we think that is. Maybe a reduction in dietary creatine compared to the amount in male, or the ability to take it up. So there is some evidence to suggest in the minimal studies that there is less. And that's probably why we see a really good response from females, but especially in vegans and vegetarians. Our study in 2003 with muscle biopsies, it was almost like the female's response was a little unbelievable. And then you say, oh, wait a minute, they only have about 50% of their muscle full of creatine. Make no wonder they respond so well. So that's why I think it's a huge push for males and females on a plant based diet to at least consider creatine. And if they're not getting creatine through red meat or seafood, obviously, this is probably why they need to at least consider those ideas.
What about the creatine activity throughout the menstrual cycle?
Yeah.
There's a beautiful chart here, and people ask
Mhm.
this: should I cycle supplementation throughout the menstrual cycle? What are your thoughts on that?
So Abby Smith Ryan in North Carolina is the world leader on this, and she's clearly showed that for young females, especially, that there's fluctuation, but creatine doesn't really have that any detrimental effect. Is the easiest way to put it. I think from a practicality standpoint, I think it's something to think of the big push right now on, does the menstrual cycle influence performance? And for the totality of evidence, it doesn't. And I think that's how a lot of females need to look at it. It may fluctuate water retention during the different phases, but at the end of the day, they're going to be taking creatine for longer than the luteal phase or follicular. They're going to be looking at it for the health benefits. So at the end of the day, I think it's a moot point. Yeah.
I'm really happy to hear you say that. I do think that there's a component to the menstrual cycle that it seems to confuse a lot of people, and making huge changes. I mean, unless you are an Olympic athlete, slow and steady is likely better. I am curious, does it have an impact on mood because of its brain effect?
Yeah, so there is some evidence that suggests mood, and we're doing a study right now in Iowa, looking at mood and energy.
I mean, you're just sitting up and Netflix and chilling all the time. I mean,
Remember, I had hair when I started, and of course, we could talk about that myth too. But
oh,
no,
we should. That's another myth
it's a
that
huge myth.
people talk. We've got to
You
go
got to
through the
talk about that
myths.
one. So
Okay, we definitely have to talk about the myths.
yeah,
But before we talk about the myths, creatine for mood.
yeah. It's one of the areas that's sort of a subjective questionnaire. When we ask people, mood has improved in a series of populations with clinical depression and non-clinical based populations. So mood, energy status, and self-esteem efficacy is one that seems to be emerging. Now, very difficult to measure, but when you ask people, now, is it maybe because they got improvements in the gym? They can perform activities at home better, but mood is one that we're starting to see an improvement, or at least some emerging evidence, and that's going to come more often than not. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now, before we get to the
Okay.
myths, what if an individual has been previously trained?
Mhm.
Let's say an individual, when they are young, they're training, their satellite cells are
Mhm.
healthy, et cetera. They've put on skeletal muscle. They've now hit midlife and fallen into the midlife trap.
Mhm.
Does previous training impact?
The answer from a scientific perspective, if we don't know, but it's logical, is very similar to the muscle memory with training. So all those precious tissues, if they're still dormant or activated, they can become reactivated. So the logical theory is that if you've taken a decade off, exercise and then creatine may give you a motivational boost to have a chance over time. But that study hasn't been done.
Thank you to First Form for sponsoring this episode of the show. Here's the deal. Creatine is really important, and many people do not eat enough dietary creatine to not only impact muscle, but bone and brain. I am on an absolute creatine kick. Here's where you're going to grab yours. If you are not on creatine, you definitely should consider it. Go to firstform.com/Dr. Lyon. That's firstform.com/Dr. Lyon. I think over the next 5 years, we are going to see more and more data come out about the importance of creatine, not from a muscle performance standpoint, that's a benefit, but from a cognitive and brain protection standpoint. This is critical because we've all seen the rates of dementia. We've seen what happens if there's anything that we can do, any dietary strategy that we can take. I think that we are going to see the influence of creatine from a cognitive perspective. Definitely grab yours. That's firstform.com/Dr. Lyon. Fair. Let's talk about some myths.
Okay.
Give me your top 3.
Okay. The number one for sure is fat mass. We've talked about that earlier, and we think we have a good idea. It doesn't. Uh, the second,
So
obviously,
creatine does not increase fat mass. Myth number
yeah,
1.
it does not. No, in combination with exercise. Number two is baldness. I literally could say creatine caused cancer, and the person say that's nice, but does it cause baldness? And they say, well, look at you. I mean, so this is interesting from the rugby study over, geez, 2 decades ago now. Only a single study has ever sort of looked at any of these measures. And in our misconception paper we put out a few years ago, we clearly showed that in these individuals, creatine increased serum DHT, a derivative of testosterone, or linked to hair follicle loss or thinning. But just like when you go to the doctor and there's a nice range for cholesterol and blood glucose, the DHT level went up within normal range. But when they were on placebo, the range or the increase did not go up. And so immediately people thought, oh, if this hormone went up, that means that's why I'm going bald. It's never been shown to cause baldness. You could argue it's never been shown not to cause baldness. But I've assessed over 1,000 people at high dose 2 years, and not a single person, biological male or female, has come to me and say, Darren, whatever you're giving me, I don't know, but my hair is thinning. So I don't know why the study hasn't been done. It'd be easy to do to look at cross-sectional area in a certain region of the head or wherever, but that is myth number, one and
2. That's number 2.
number two. The third one is, I think, do I need to take a loading phase? And people often think, well, because all the products that you buy on a label suggest the loading phase. The answer is 100% no. You do not need to take the loading phase. That's primarily only for athletes. If you're taking it for longevity or health purposes, you can start as little as 3 grams a day, and you can work your way up to maybe 5 or more if you want. So those are three of the biggest. Oh, sorry. And then kidney and liver function would be a close one. There's no adverse effects, and God, they've done randomized control trials since the early 2000s. High dose, moderate dose, low dose, no adverse effects compared to placebo.
That is extremely helpful. Where do you think the creatine research is going? What would you like to see
Yeah,
done?
I think we have a good grasp on muscle. We still have a little bit more. Of course, we talk about the protein synthesis rates and a little bit more cells and enzymes, but the next push will primarily be bone research. But even bigger there, I think, is from the neck up. And we sort of put out a really good review last year, sort of exploring the idea, can this compound, with or without exercise, have brain beneficial effects? And it has some application for depression and anxiety. PTSD falls in that category. What about concussion? It's not really shown a lot of promise now for the neurophysiological or muscular conditions such as Parkinson's or Lou Gehrig's disease, but it has been shown to have some benefits for muscular dystrophy. So that's, I think, where the next 20 or 30 years will go. There is a study, I'm super excited. I can't wait for this to come out, looking at its effect on Alzheimer's disease. And we're started looking at people with predisposed dementia. Can it improve their way of life? And you can throw everything we know about muscle and bone away. If it improves some aspects of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, that could have profound effects from a global initiative. And that's why I'm started to get involved now from a Creatine for Global Health initiative. Maybe there should be DRIs for creatine in certain populations. If they're not eating a lot of meat in certain parts of the world, can this help offset some of those effects? So it's a huge push. And I think you're going to start to see creatine not just for athletes, but for health purposes.
And is there a way to identify if someone is taking enough? Is there a variability in absorption, for example? Older adults seem to require more, or maybe they just don't absorb nutrients. I know that you said it is unscathed through the gastrointestinal tract. But for example, if a 74-year-old man took 10 grams of creatine, would you then say, we want their creatinine number in the blood to be X to ensure that in fact, they do need the 10 grams versus the 20 grams.
The best way to do is you do a muscle biopsy or MRS to look at the effects if you can't get ethical approval for the biopsy, and measure how much creatine they had in their skeletal muscle at baseline, and then see the effects with a dosing titration over time. And you're right, you want more of it to go into the muscle, less being cleared from the kidney. And then you would even extrapolate it more. Can you use the magnet to look at the effects potentially in the brain? So maybe some individuals may respond very optimally to 7. Some individuals may need 21 grams, but you need to do dosing studies. And then you also need to look at different compartments, especially in the brain, white matter versus gray. So these are excellent suggestions. And I think this is probably where the next 20 or 30 years will go, determining the optimal dose for the tissue you want. But if you say, I'm just looking at it from a whole body perspective, that's another way to do it. So these dosing studies need to be really critical, kind of similar to what the last 30 years of protein research has looked at. 10 grams is too low, 20 grams for young, 40 grams or more for older. Jorn's throwing a wrench in there now with 100 grams. And we're sort of...
No, we did it. We did an analysis.
Yeah, an analysis
on that. I'll send it to you. We did an
absolutely.
analysis
And
on
so
that paper. Of course,
it's very evolving. I love it. And I think the dosing area is the next sort of wave. Yeah.
And from clinical application for physicians, for health coaches, for trainers listening, could they, if they were looking at blood work, could they say, okay, this person has been now started on 10 grams of creatine. Are you expecting to see any kind of routine blood marker changes?
The main one would be your serum creatinine. So I think if you said, hey, let's start at 3 grams, get your blood work, I'd be shocked. That's a very small amount. The muscle can retain it. But if you start to notice over time that the muscle became saturated, the more you're taking in, unless it's going to bone or other tissues such as brain, you would get a slight elevation in creatinine. And that's an elevation, easy one to measure in the blood, that can be routinely measured. Yeah.
And would that be something that you're looking for? Would that be a goal? Or would that just say, hey, this is now saturated. The body is now excreting everything else?
That's how, exactly. I would look at it as a saturation perspective. If you said, hey, we're going to go from 3 to 10 grams, and then all of a sudden when you went to 10 grams over a month and you notice your creatinine doubled, it's probably that the muscle is full. But then you would say, hey, how are we going to now measure what's going into bone and brain? We just don't know that. And that's something that I'm sure will happen down the road.
It's very exciting, and you are truly pioneering it. And typically, just when things are catching on, people are usually ready to talk about something else in a different aspect. Does that happen to you? For example, just as everything now on muscle has caught up, now you're ready to switch topics to...
Yeah, we were sort of getting really excited with the bone, and we are, but then all of a sudden the brain started to take over. And I think most questions I get now, and we're going to revisit the bone, but we're still revisiting muscles, specifically in older adults with sarcopenia and frailty and shut-ins and long-term care facilities. So I think that all 3 of those major tissues. And then what about the immune system? That's the one that never gets a lot of love or press. But when you measure cytokines after extensive exercise and they're down-regulated with creatine or reduction in protein catabolism, the immune system, could it have implications during when we had COVID What about a future pandemic? These are areas. So I think the immune system, which is magical, is an area that we could sort of look at some new evolving areas like that. So I'm super excited, very passionate about it. It's kind of interesting. We knew a lot in the 90s, and we kind of just got bored of it. And now it's sort of taken on a life of its own. So I'm riding the 2 seconds of interest, and I'm very excited about it. Yeah.
The resurgence, this might be a nice place to tie in glutamine with the immune system and creatine.
Exactly.
I know this guy, he knows a thing or two
Yes.
about
Yep.
glutamine. Might look him up. His name is Darren Candow.
Yes. Look at my thesis and be like, holy cow, how much did you give him? I'm like, a lot. Yeah.
Dr. Darren Candow, thank you so much for joining me on the show. You are really paving the way. And what is so wonderful is you're a full-time academic who is out there teaching and really preaching this. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time. Thank you.